Well, hello, good evening, and welcome back. Thanks for joining us here in AOPA's Pilot Information Center webinar series. Our topic for our webinar this evening is Flying to Cuba. I'm Ferdi Mack with AOPA's Pilot Information Center in Frederick, Maryland. Our featured presenter this evening is Craig Spence. Craig is the Secretary General of the International Council of AOPAs. Good evening, Craig.
Good evening, Ferdi. How are you?
I'm quite well. Thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I'm really looking forward to tapping your expertise and experience.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
Can you give me 30 seconds on the IAOPA? That may not be a five-letter name that many people are familiar with.
Well, I appreciate that. International Council of Aircraft Owner and Pilots Associations, IAOPA, 75 affiliates throughout the globe. AOPA US is a member. We have Canadian Owners and Pilots Association, AOPA Australia, AOPA UK. We have 75 affiliates basically protecting the freedom to fly globally. So we also have observer status at ICAO. We represent the interests of general aviation on an international front and throughout the globe.
Excellent, excellent. So I would imagine with that task, your passport, are you one of those guys that has those extra passport pages in your book you have to ask for?
I got the large passport, and luckily, thanks to global entry now, I don't have it stamped as much. Otherwise, I've been going through it a lot faster. But yeah, we do definitely have the extra pages.
Yeah, I was going to pick up my own personal TSA pre. I didn't need global entry, and their systems went down that day, so I need to get back over there to Baltimore to pick that up myself.
Definitely.
Well, thanks so much for being here. Before we start, though, we have a few housekeeping notes for our participants this evening. Regarding viewing and later viewing of this webinar will be preserved on our web server for later viewing. You can find it by using the same link that you used to join us this evening. However, you will also receive a link to the webinar once the recording has been posted within an hour after our webinar concludes this evening. So you'll have a copy in your email for preservation. We're going to try to run about an hour tonight, running length, and that'll include about 45 minutes of presentation with about 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes at the end for us to try to answer some of the most common questions that have been submitted. Regarding question submission, many of you may already be familiar with, or some of you may find that you have a box in your viewing window where you can submit questions. I won't be able to answer many of your questions via typing responses this evening as we're working through the content, but I will be monitoring what some of the more common question threads are as Craig is presenting. And that'll allow us to do two things. Number one, compile the common questions for our Q&A at the end. And it'll also allow us, if we're on a relevant slide that pertains to a flurry of questions we might get, we'll stop there on that slide and answer that question at that time if that works out as well. So either way, we will do our best to address your questions and comments. Finally, if you do experience any audio or video problems, if slides aren't visible or if the audio is choppy or if the audio drops off, two recommendations for you. Number one, try to minimize the other bandwidth usage wherever you are. For instance, if you're at home, if you can maybe get one of the kids off their Netflix or Xbox, that might preserve some bandwidth to allow the presentation to be delivered to you better. And then also, if you do have an issue that isn't resolved by that, try to refresh, reload the page, close your window, close your browser, reload it, or maybe try a different device. If you're on a mobile device, maybe try a laptop or a desktop computer. So that's it for our show notes. So without further ado, Craig, let's dive right in, shall we?
Great, thank you. Let me start off with some 30,000-foot comments. This webinar is for informational purposes. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not in a position to give a legal reading or interpretation of the rules. It's our intent to let our members know information we've gathered and general best operating practices and how these regulations apply to them. Second, we were listening to our original podcast that we had from December 22nd, 2014. Mm-hmm. A lot has changed in nearly that 18 months.
Good.
It's remarkable, and a lot more changes on the way, so keep that in mind. Third item I want to bring up is you may have, you will hear throughout this webinar talking about third-party providers. Basically, you don't have to do it alone as you're trying to think about and plan the trip. There are a number of organizations that have done this, that do this, and are very good at what they do. And that can be the difference between a successful and unsuccessful trip. AOPA is in the process of updating our resource pages to contain those third-party providers and provide links for it. All of them are not up at this time, but that is work in progress. And in the interim, if you have questions, we'll field them here at AOPA headquarters. Also, don't let any part of this webinar scare you into not going. We're going to go deep into some regulations and some other restrictions, but don't let that scare you into not going. With the proper planning and guidance, the trip can be very rewarding. But at the same point in time, it's not the same as travel to Canada, Mexico, and the Bahamas like most of us are used to.
So two things. You said the trip can be very rewarding. At the top of the hour, I said we're going to rely on your expertise and experience. So my understanding is that you were one of the select few that actually made this GA trip to Cuba recently.
Yes, and my experience at making the visit, not planning the visit, I can tell you we started planning the visit back in January of 2015, following the announcement that the President had made that there would be changes at an ICAO meeting up in Montreal representing IAOPA. I had the pleasure of meeting with the equivalent of the Cuban FAA, the IACC.
Perfect.
It was a very good meeting. We talked about what would happen, what's needed to happen in order for general aviation travel to the island to be a pleasant journey. They're very, very interested in making it good for pilots. They recognize how important it is, and they realize that they have some areas that they need to work on. And so we started assembling a trip to go down there. There were many roadblocks in the regulatory side, primarily on the United States side. Those have subsequently been cleared up in regulatory announcements and changes that we're going to go over here. But we were able last month to meet with representatives of the IACC and explain to them what information and how AOPA could assist. I also had the pleasure, as did the other members on the delegation, to meet with representatives of the Aviation Club of Cuba. And they are very excited about the future of general aviation and the potential general aviation activities that there are in the island. So it was a very rewarding trip. It was nonstop down there, meetings, come back, but it was very rewarding.
As a slight look ahead to something we're going to cover, you mentioned pleasant trip. You're talking about the travel itself, and what I want to make sure that there's a clear understanding of is we're not talking about a pleasant trip start to finish that includes sitting on the beach and being a tourist. We're going to get into those details.
That's absolutely correct. Right. For regulatorily and legally, tourist travel to the island still remains prohibited. But as we'll go into, there are general licenses and other regulatory qualifiers that if you fit into that category, the trip is perfectly legal and can be accomplished.
And finally, before I let you go on your way here with this slide, I think it's worth noting for clarification that in almost every case when we talk about compliance with regulations, we're talking about the U.S. side. We're not talking about the Cuba side, with few exceptions.
With few exceptions, correct. There's obviously immigration, flight planning, other restrictions like that are required in Cuba, but a majority of the stumbling blocks, at least that we encountered at first, were legally complying with U.S. regulations. Some of the things we're going to touch on real quick, and again, as we talked about, that December 2014, the President, in a bold announcement, started to establish diplomatic ties with the island. At that point in time, we started to consult with the different federal agencies to see how that would be impacting general aviation. And up until a few weeks later, there's absolutely no change. And what was surprising is the time frame that it took for them to get their change out. By government standards, a little over 6 weeks is absolutely remarkable. And we've had 3 further updates since that time, further loosening the requirements for travel. We'll go into those in just a second. We're also going to touch on some of the unique aspects of traveling to Cuba that are different from the other islands and the other international destinations. And finally, items that normally you wouldn't need to check, but are pretty much essential as you travel to Cuba. All right. The major regulatory changes that we talked about. December 14th, you had the presidential announcement. And then January 15th, the initial regulatory change was announced that authorizes travel that used to require specific licenses are now able to travel under a general license, meaning that, and we'll go into this in greater detail in just a second, meaning that a specific permit is not required. If you met the criteria, you could fall or qualify and travel under a general license, no paperwork required. It also allowed travel agents and airlines to provide services without the special need from of a license from the government. In the past, anybody that provided travel services would have to be licensed by the government, and that changed with that January 15th. That opened a lot of doors. The next major announcement was September 15th, and that change authorized private aircraft and vessels, boats, to travel without, again, needing a specific permit for up to 7 days. As I said earlier, when we were planning our trip, one of the major stumbling blocks was we were going to fly our private aircraft. It was one thing to take an airline. It's the next thing to try and take your private aircraft. Under the old rules, it was considered an export when we left, and an import when we came back in. And as such,
you just can't export anything either.
Exactly. Lots of controls on that.
Did you know that the Sony PlayStation at some point was not able to be shipped to every country?
I did not know that.
It was regulated by export because the wrong country could use it to perform simulations on how to build a nuclear bomb.
Exactly. That's the type of rules.
And we've got such hardware in there, like our G1000 aircraft, that, you know, those can come under this notion of, is this really something that could be exported? And that's why the notion of if an airplane is being viewed as an export is actually important. It's not the stuff in the airplane, it's the airplane itself.
Yes, exactly. And you look at today's GA cockpits, even iPads, computers, and so forth would have fallen into those categories.
Yep.
The next was January 2016, this year, and that announcement facilitated travel further by aircraft by authorizing additional travel-related services. It kind of freed up a number of things that are important to pilots, spare parts, all these other good things. And then finally, and the most significant change that I see, March 16, building on the previous changes and further relaxing the travel restrictions. The most significant change for GA is the people-to-people educational travel that makes it more accessible and less costly. And we'll go into that in a second. It's important to remember that these regulations that came out, though, were not addressed at general aviation specifically. They were directed at the U.S. economy wide, and they covered areas such as banking, telecommunications, exports, agriculture. So there's a lot of different aspects involved. They weren't released just for GA. Okay. Before we get too down in the weeds here, there's a couple different players that we're going to talk about that are really important. The first one is the Office of Foreign Asset Control. And you'll hear me talk about that throughout the evening as OFAC. And that's a branch of the Treasury Department, and they're responsible for implementing and enforcing the U.S. sanctions throughout the globe. So before the restrictions were lifted, we had sanctions, we still have sanctions in place in Cuba. There were sanctions in place on other countries, Iran, everyone's familiar with, North Korea, and so on and so forth. So OFAC is a major player in determining whether or not GA can travel to the island. The second is the Bureau of Industrial Security, BIS. That's a subsection of Commerce, and they're responsible for developing the export control policies, issuing export license, and prosecuting any of the violations. And that's what we talked about. They're the PlayStation guys, and they're the ones that we're watching the airport. You also then have the usual State Department, FAA, CBP, and the other agencies. One other thing, the Cuban government, and I think I mentioned this earlier, but I do want to highlight it. They want travel to the island to be pleasant experience, and they're working both with the FAA and AOPA and others to improve that process. So you may hear roadblocks, but there's a lot of work underway to try and eliminate those roadblocks.
Were you the one that had told me that we were receiving a contact from Cuba who was interested in getting detail about how, from an airport design perspective?
Yes, exactly. One of the early questions we got from them was, how do we install tie-down ropes? And for a lot of the airports down there, they didn't even have tie-down anchors. And so we had to come up, we got the FAA design manual out and sent them the standard measurements and said, here's a good place to start, and hopefully we can talk about this when we get down there.
And to me, the fact that they're asking those questions, not that they're coming to us, but the fact that they're asking those questions is a positive indicator.
Very positive, very positive. And that's, again, a lot of change coming in the next 18 months to 2 years as well. As far as the ways to travel to Cuba, I talked about licenses. The old way, it used to be if you qualified for certain criteria that you could apply and receive, if they deemed it was acceptable, a license in order to travel for that purpose. And that license came both from OFAC and BIS. So if I, for example, for our professional meetings, we would have to submit a form, and we did, rather lengthily online, that said, here's what we're doing, here's what we're going under, is this approved? And then you get back a yes. Once you get back a yes from OFAC, you would then go to BIS and say, okay, they told me I could fly, I want to bring my airplane, can I bring my airplane?
Mom said I can stay the night. Go ask your father.
Exactly, exactly. And then once all of that paperwork was in order, then you could start the planning process. What the lifting of the travel restrictions has done, primarily in the past, where if I met these criteria, I would have to apply for a license. Now I qualify under a general license, and that means, in essence, if you meet these criteria and certify that you meet these criteria, you don't need special permit from us. And then BIS came back and said, guess what? If you meet these criteria, you don't need special permission from us in order to bring the aircraft down.
All right, Craig, stand by for just a moment. Okay. Test 1, 2. Can you hear us now? Stand by, everyone, if you can hear us. I'm trying to get a hold of our producer. Can you hear us?
I turned my phone on.
No, we're not on the line. Stand by. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back with you. We had a minor technical difficulty with the phone there for a moment. I hope you're still with us. We're back with you again. So we'll go ahead and proceed. Our producer's giving us the thumbs up, so it looks like we're back on the road. Sorry about the hiccup there. Ladies and gentlemen, hope you can hear us again. We had a minor technical issue with our phones here this evening. Trying to determine if we're back online again. We're working with our producer. Sit tight just for a moment. We'll see if we get the thumbs up. So sorry for the inconvenience. Bear with us. Okay. Looks like we're with you again. If you're still with us, thank you so much for sitting tight while we got through that technical difficulty. We're back, and we're in another room. Hopefully you can hear us just as well. Craig, we were just looking at the notion of whether or not we could now travel to Cuba under the auspice of a general license, and to be able to exercise that general license, we'd have to fall into certain categories. Can we go over those?
Sure, no problem. The general licenses that you see are on the screen. It's important to note that if you travel for any one of these exemptions, the specific exemption and permission is no longer required per se. Each general license, however, does have qualifying criteria that need to be met, and I would refer each individual to the specific regulation for those criteria. Don't think that if you're going down to help somebody paint their porch that it's support for the Cuban people. It's not as simple as that. There's guidelines that need to be followed there.
Okay. We didn't really run down the list once we got our audio back.
Sure. Let me go through that then. Family visits, those people that have family down in Cuba. Official government business, which is visits by the government to the island. Journalistic activity. And this means that if you're a full-time journalist and that's how you make your living, and you're going down there, you can qualify under that. That doesn't mean if I have a camera or an iPod or something like that, that would automatically work. Professional research and meetings, which is what we went to. Educational activities, which is also where the people-to-people is at. Religious activities, public performance, clinics, competitions, sporting competitions, etc. Support for the Cuban people, humanitarian projects, private foundations, research, export and import transmit information, and then, again, authorized export transactions. Those are all covered in the specific regulations.
So the one thing I wanted to hit here is that we're talking about a serious process. And what I'm trying to get at is you can't just pull up this list and try to fish through this list of 12 and maybe find something that you might fit the mold for just because you want to go to Cuba. Craig mentioned the idea just because you have a camera doesn't mean you can go under the auspices of being a journalist. You'd have to be employed as a journalist, I believe you mentioned.
Exactly.
So instead of trying to figure out which one of these you might be able to use, it's actually the reverse case. You would already be operating as far as what you do, either for a living or for the greater good, you'd be able to utilize that experience and that profession to fit through one of these 12 gates in order to travel to Cuba.
Right, and the biggest way forward right now, quite honestly, with a number of changes that have been made, is in the people-to-people educational aspect. But that does require a comprehensive program and making sure that it's not, you're not going to go people to people and just hang out on the beach, okay? You're going to do interaction.
Craig, you're actually answering a question we just got here. I just want to fly and stay for 2 or 3 days on the beach. That is not possible from our friend at Arrows.com.
Yeah, I would go to Bahamas, Cancun, any one of those islands. That is not permissible at this point in time. It's important to note that the administration has gone very far in easing these restrictions, but there are certain legislative changes that have to take place before tourist travel is permitted, at which time then you can go out and hang on the beach. But right now, that's not in the cards.
Okay.
Some of the other changes that the latest regulations, as we mentioned, a U.S. registered aircraft can stay in Cuba for up to 7 days. In the past, with the infinite wisdom, the aircraft could go, but the aircrew couldn't stay. So, say a corporate aircraft was going down and they were going to spend 4 nights on the ground,
the aircrew actually had to leave the airplane there and leave the island because they weren't going to be doing anything else. But now that's changed, and the aircraft can stay for up to 7 days, crew included. They can also open and maintain bank accounts in Cuba. It's important to note that a lot of these regulations are focused on the banking industry, and while they have been lessened and liberalized, there is still a lot of confusion around using credit cards and debit cards. Those are not available down there at this present time. You're not going to find an ATM, and there are still restrictions on charges and how that money is transacted. So that's one of the complicating issues. There is no dollar limit on expenses. If it's, again, normal travel expenses for housing, goods, and food as it relates to one of those criteria. They also made changes for access to air ambulances and emergency medical services. They've listed that you can bring 400 goods back to the United States. That's $100 in alcohol and or tobacco, not 100 in cigars and 100 in rum, but a total of 100 between the two. And also important, traveling under a general license, you can bring a close relative, and by that I mean someone living in the home, a spouse, a partner, and the catch to this, though, is they must attend the same activities as the person that was approved to go under the general license. And then also, if grounded for aircraft maintenance, it's now easier to get parts. It's also important to remember there are no FAA certified mechanics on the island, so if you break, in the past it was quite cumbersome getting the part in, replacement part. The changes that the OFAC has made that an easier process. You still need to go back to the United States and have that brought over, but right now it's become much more easier.
So Craig, two related questions. We've talked quite a bit about this general license notion. Someone's asking, is that general license a physical document?
No. What you have to do is be able to certify that you meet the requirements. Once you do, then you are, in essence, approved to go.
Okay. Also, something we hit on early on, but it's worth revisiting. Alfonso's asking us, who is imposing all these objections?
Those are from the United States. These are laws that were put forth over the years, and certain policies can be repealed, but legislation has to be repealed that basically prohibits the tourist traffic to Cuba.
And TK wants to know, who is monitoring our activities while we're in Cuba to make sure that we comply with all this stuff?
It's kind of like, who's monitoring your taxes? I can do my taxes and claim I have 14 dependents, and get my refund back, and then about 6 months later I can get a call from a representative at the IRS that says, all right, show me your 14 people. So
you really want to have to sit down and have that conversation.
Exactly.
Same thing we'd say with respect to operating guidelines here with the FAA. You really want to be sitting across the table from that safety inspector from your local FSDO, trying to explain why you decided that something was okay.
Exactly.
All right, next slide.
As far as general restrictions, again, we mentioned travel for the exclusive purpose of tourism is not allowed. The Cuban embargo does remain in place. Most transactions outside of routine travel purchases are still prohibited, and OFAC continues to enforce the Cuban asset control regulation. So very good question that we had there earlier. One item that is unique that you want to look at in Cuba, which is different from traveling to Canada and some of the others, is insurance coverage in the past had exclusions for travel to Cuba. That is changing. Now, many companies are, if you notify them that you're going, they want proof what general license you're traveling under, self-certification document, then they will cover you for the travel to Cuba. But it's important, before you do go to the island, that you check with your insurer to make sure that, in fact, you are covered.
Okay.
Next, financing the aircraft. Believe it or not, if you have a note on your aircraft, there may be a portion of that note that says you will not go to Cuba, or if you do go to Cuba, you will notify us. That was something that we overcame, and it's not a big issue. They just want to know that you're going there, and it dates back to laws that have been in existence for a while, that the progress and the paperwork on other organizations hasn't caught up with reality yet. So it's not a stumbling block, it's just something you need to be aware of.
And those last two slides are interesting because, so far we've been talking about regulatory compliance. Everything from my flight review and my valid medical, which are a little more obvious to those of us flying regularly and flying domestically, to the extension of flight outside the boundaries of the country, specifically Cuba. But then again, we're also talking about things where you have to look at yourself and your own operation, not what the federal government or any country or state is requiring, and say, besides maybe a survival kit and things like that you would consider, insurance and finance, probably from some of the least considered notions.
Yep, we've got that covered. I don't even deal with it, but again, this is one of the nuances that is different. They're not insurmountable. This is not, again, to scare anybody, but these are things you need to put on your checklist as you're starting to plan if I'm going to make this trip.
All right.
Also, visa and immigration. One of the unique aspects is all travelers to Cuba, regardless of which general license you're going on, are required to get a visa from the Cuban embassy in order to travel. Now that average takes between 30, 60 days. However, we were fortunate, and this is again one of the benefits of using a third-party provider, that we were able to have that ordered early and coordinated so that when we landed, our visa was there. So you have two options of doing this. Number one is going to the Cuban embassy and getting permission, getting the visa that way. And the second is for, if you're working with a third-party provider, have that coordinated. It's also important to note, and the reason I say check with the Cuban embassy, depending on what reason you're going down and what general license, they would like to know who's down there. If I'm going for journalism or commercial activity, those are particularly of importance, and they most likely that will require you to go through the embassy. But again, it's another item to check off as you're going through.
Okay.
Health and medical requirements. This is kind of also a throwback, but it's another thing you want to take a look at. Call your insurance provider, your health insurance provider, and make sure that there are no restrictions for you on the island. Make sure that they cover that. It used to be that the visitors were required to purchase temporary Cuban health insurance. Some say yes, some say no. So it's one of those things that's still in flux at this point in time.
And as you've highlighted on the slide there, since the answer is unclear to us, to those that need the answer, the embassy can provide the details.
Exactly.
Cuban embassy here in Washington, D.C.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. And then the next thing, which is, again, this will be a classic demonstration of how regulations have not caught up with reality here. Prior to March 21st of this year, there was a customs regulation, and it's 19 CFR 122 Section O. And that basically said that if I am traveling to the island, that I must depart and return to only the 19 airports listed on this slide. It didn't have to be the same. I could go out of Key West, come back in Tampa, but I was limited exclusively to those slides. The Customs and Border Protection issued a final notice in the Federal Register that said, well, guess what? We have removed that requirement, and now if it is a port of entry, I can go depart or arrive as if it were any other airport. So I'm not just limited to those 19 airports. However, I would recommend that you continue to, until things get normalized, I'd suggest you continue to think about flying into and out of those airports, as the U.S. Customs officers that are working there are familiar with the Cuba operations. It's going to take a while for them to train up the other 138, 137 ports of entry into what's expected. So I think it would be good, smart decision-making right now to use those airports until other things come online.
Best practice, make things easy on yourself and the folks with the guns.
Exactly.
Craig, take a drink. I know you've been talking a lot. I do have a question, though, on that slide. Talked about depart and return from using one of those anchor airports. For the amateur, it would appear maybe as though that probably might only matter for our return, because our return is when we're going to go through scrutiny, right? And we talked about this earlier, and you set me straight that that's not the case, that it's not just the return that, right?
Absolutely. And here's where the reality catching up with the regulations comes into play. If we look at the next slide, there's still an FAA regulation, FAR 91709, and that guides the operations to and from Cuba. And the number one part of that regulation is depart from a designated airport, one of the 19. So even though Customs has eliminated that, that's still a federal regulation. Additionally, it says DVFR or IFR flight plan, which is a little misleading because you have to be on an IFR flight plan. Cuba does not allow for VFR.
Thank you for hitting that. We did have some questions this evening about, can I pop over there for lunch? Can I do some VFR? I'm an aerobatic pilot. I want to take my VFR only PIPs to the island.
No, and again, with the PIPs, that's an experimental aircraft. So experimental aircraft, unless you have the permission of the country bringing it to you, you really can't bring it out of the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing here, you have to produce a written statement 1 hour before departure with the Office of Immigration and Naturalization Service at that airport, which details the information you see on the slide. Well, to tell you how dated that is, INS hasn't been around since around 2002, 2003, since the creation of Homeland Security.
It's like 9X became Bell Atlantic, 9X Mobile became,
exactly,
et cetera, et cetera.
So here again is regulations not catching up with reality. The problem is these are still on the books, and we're working to get these done. We're working to get these changed, but you need to be aware of them, that it's out there. Some other considerations, which everyone, again, this is different from normal operations, and then some the same. The first one is the Automated Passenger Information System, APIS. APIS, I know, is a thorn in the side of many pilots. It's, however, good to know that we have almost 99.9% compliance.
Mm-hmm.
Since the program was implemented, there have been over 1 million cross-border operations, and we think the last number of fines we've had was 35. So the level of compliance on that is fantastic. And what that does is that sets up for all sorts of other programs. Maybe we'll do a podcast or a webinar on it later on that AOPA is working on. But not only are there APIS requirements for the U.S. in and out, there's also APIS requirements for going into Cuba. And it's a relatively straightforward process, but it does need to be accomplished as part of the pre-flight planning process.
Now, whereas United States e-APIS is required for transiting the border in either direction, didn't you mention that the Cuba APIS system is only for one direction? Or
That's correct. It's only inbound.
It's only inbound, and
Yes.
the APIS needs to be filed for Cuba. Through the internet, online, I can do it here from the States, the privacy of my own home, sitting in my den.
It's via an Excel spreadsheet. Again, here's where we get into the third-party provider, being able to help you. They've already they're working your visa information, so now it's just another part of the process. They're able to take care of that.
Okay, great.
Excuse me. The other consideration are, as we mentioned earlier, banking restrictions. While many of the regulations have been loosened, the banks have not caught up with the loosened regulations yet. So don't expect to land there, pull out your credit card in order to pay for gas, ground services, landing fees, and the other, because that's not going to happen. So the banking restrictions are a big obstacle right now that you need to be aware of. However, one of the biggest obstacles is hotel availability. Because of the popularity and the releasing the travel restrictions, most hotels are booked 30, 60, 90 days out. There is a separate economy where you can get villas and things like that starting to emerge on the market. but it's not something like I can go on Kayak or Chavillo and all of a sudden pop up all these other beautiful hotels. And if I do, again, we go back to the banking restrictions where there's complications in getting payment secured for that. Domestic travel. Once I'm in the island, the U.S. regulations allow for one additional leg, not one additional trip, round trip, but one additional leg. For example, we went down to Havana, then we took a IFR flight to Valadero, which is about 65, 70 miles northeast, and that is also a port of entry and a port of departure, and from there we were able to depart back to the United States.
And then were you able to? You had to.
We had to, yes. The plane could not go anywhere else from there according to U.S. regulations. So don't think we'll go to Havana and then we'll go down and see what's happening in Gitmo and the other sides of the island. So there are restrictions that are in place.
And there's no provision to to amend that restriction by way of purchasing a cruising permit or anything like that.
Exactly. Not at this current time.
Okay.
And as we mentioned, no VFR. Another big thing, regulatory ambiguity, and it's constantly evolving. There are, I'm sure, many experts listening on this webinar as well, whose almost full-time job is trying to track this and follow this. I do this a lot, but it's hard for me to keep up. So all I can say is, if you have questions, that's why AOPA and the Pilot Information Center is here to help you work through those issues. We may not have them, but we're going to work to find out for you and get you the answers on that. So just understand things are in a state of flux right now, and it's hard to nail down a specific answer in many questions. The rules get tricky for flights involving a third country.
Let me stop you right there because we've had a few questions in that regard. I want to give you two scenarios and then you can bundle it all up. For example, if everything goes ordinarily as a flight from Florida to Cuba and back, but upon leaving Cuba I want to stop in the Bahamas on the way back, or scenario B, I want to leave Florida and use Cuba as a refueling stop on my way to a subsequent country in Central America. So tell me about those multi-point situations.
That is where I would say contact OFAC, because the regulations are not at all clear in that is permissible.
So for starters, the first thing you would say is those sorts of additional points on your route complicate things significantly.
And that's where we step back to the first part. I'm not a lawyer. This is where you need to get. This is one of those questions, if you're contemplating that, I would get and I would secure permission from OFAC in writing that is permissible, that they will allow that. That way you're covered. But right now, it greatly complicates the planning process and greatly complicates any efforts you have.
Okay. And then last bullet on this slide, I think, is where we are.
Sure. The final thing is records retention. Under the regulations by OFAC, you have to keep for up to 5 years your regulations and your documents pertaining to the trip. The only exception is, again, under the people-to-people, where it says that the travel provider can do that for the individual. If you're going to do that, I would make sure that you get that in writing from the travel provider so that there's a clear understanding that he's going to be the one, he or she will be maintaining those documents and not me. Personally, even though I do my taxes, I make a copy, I make a hard copy, I back up that copy. I just want to have that just in case. So the records retention 5-year period for your planning and your activities afterwards.
Let's hang here just for a moment. Somebody asked a question, and it related back to something we touched on in our rehearsal that I wanted to elaborate on. The question was, how many Cuban airports are available to accommodate GA aircraft? And that also folds in with this idea, we're not using 3 countries for our flight plan. We're going from Florida to Cuba and back. The trivial, no, not trivial, the less complicated case. But while I'm in Cuba, I can make one leg, as you said.
Right.
So are there airports that I might want to use to make a leg to try to do some travel? And how many airports are there?
It's important not to look at just how many airports, but what services are available at those airports. For example, we went to Havana, and Varadero, and those are two ports of entry. So we completed our inbound and our outbound with their immigrations. We complied with U.S. law. They had ground services available. They had aircraft parking available. That's another factor. There is a limited amount of general aviation parking at these facilities.
How limited?
At one major airport, we were told 30 airplanes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not 30 airplanes per day. That's 30 airplanes on the ramp.
Meaning that those are the 20 of those are, or some of those are based there?
They wouldn't be based there, but if I have a Gulfstream and a Malibu and a Mooney and Cherokee that all spend 4 days,
Mm-hmm.
that's 4 days that 4 planes are occupied. So that brings us now down to about 26 airplanes.
Mm-hmm.
So space is a very big factor. That's one of the issues they're working on. And it is a limiter right now as far as the development and growth of GA to the island.
Okay. Reminds me of Cedar Key, Florida. I think they have half a dozen spots and no tie-downs. Beautiful place, though. Worth going to.
Exactly.
Have you been there? You're not?
No,
Oh, okay.
you're talking exactly the same situation there.
Okay.
One other thing, we didn't go into the flight planning requirements.
Oh, yes.
And landing permits and navigation permits from the IACC are all required. We're starting to run out of time.
Sorry, IACC?
I'm sorry, yes, thank you. That's the equivalent of the FAA down there. So don't just get in your aircraft, do all the planning here, head out from Key West and say, I'm going to Cuba. You need to secure permission from the government. You need to secure a landing permit. You need to secure a navigation permit. You need to secure how you're going to be handled on the ground like that. You will be turned away at the ATIS, and you will be met upon landing by probably some people that want to know why you're just getting up and heading out to Cuba. So we didn't go into that. We could probably spend a whole nother webinar talking about that. But again, I go back to our third-party providers. They're familiar with these processes. They know what to do that will keep you out of that trouble. So that's where you need to really seek their help.
One more thing on this slide. No VFR. Implication IFR is required. I think IFR, especially as an instructor, one of the common things I think of is good communication skills. Tell me what the communications are like down there. Is language an issue?
Language, as far as flying, was not an issue. The controllers spoke English very fluently, very courteous, very patient, very understanding, welcomed us to the island. So the communication with ATC was top-notch. They're used to handling overflight traffic and handoffs with the FAA. So again, very professional cadre from what we experienced. However, on the island, it's a different story. If you don't speak Spanish, you will have troubles communicating a lot of your ideas because English is not spoken. It is spoken in pockets and with people, but it's not where you will find in other locations. And so it could present problems on the ground.
Okay. I went ahead and jumped to the next slide because we've got
Sure.
people anxious to get some links to sink their teeth into and some contact info. So let me see here. For example, someone was asking for, is there more information on the Cuban APIS? Is there a website for that?
Yes, there is. I do not have it listed here. We'll go ahead and get that information to Ferdi, and hopefully he can post it. We'll get that posted on the AOPA Resources website, and then also perhaps if we can do a follow-up and post it on here. I'm not sure whether technically we can do that, but we will get that information to you.
Okay. While we hover with this link slide, two things I want to mention. Well, number one, we're going to start getting into the questions here a little deeper while we have about 10 minutes left. But also, don't worry if this slide with the links on it is going to disappear soon, or if it's hard to read, or you don't want to scribble down notes. As I said at the top of the hour, you will be receiving a link to this entire presentation in your email, in your inbox, within an hour after we're finished. And you can use that link to jump back into this presentation and scrub ahead to this point, which is about 50 minutes into the presentation now, where you can bring up this slide and take a look at these links. So they're not going to go away. They'll be there for you after we jump past this page. Let's see. I had somebody asking why IFR only. Do you have any foothold on that?
I
I know the Bahamas are sometimes, Bahamas I think no night VFR, for example.
Yeah, it's as you know, the flight rules vary from country to country. China, there is no VFR. Russia, there is no VFR. Many countries do not allow VFR flight. This is just the way that their regulations are. Again, they're not used to the general aviation act that we have, so the prohibition, anything that takes off has to fly under IFR.
Right. Okay. Let's see here. I'm trying to get through some more of the questions. Bear with me for a moment. We had a little hiccup. A whole lot of you jumped in when we had audio problems, letting me know that you could hear us. I appreciate that. Let's see. Lots of people want to make a day trip. Can I just fly over there to see what a native Cuban lunch is like?
No, that goes into the tourist. We're back to the general.
Right, and so just to be clear, we're not talking about the fact that Craig and I are making a cost-benefit analysis here to say it would be really difficult for you to go over just for lunch. It's more complicated than that. We're reiterating the fact that the purpose of that trip to go over and have lunch is not something that's currently legal to do.
Correct. Unless you are an owner of a restaurant and you're thinking about expanding, then you could possibly, but that falls into another category. And so, bottom line, no. Going to lunch is tourist travel, and that's not permissible under the current laws.
Right. Right. Let's see.
Oh, there was one real quick. I'm a Cuban American citizen. Would I have the same access to Cuba as an American citizen? There are additional restrictions, and that deals with the embassy and visa permitting process. So I would advise consulting the Cuban embassy prior to any travel over there. But there are different visa requirements and restrictions for Cuban citizens or people that were born in Cuba.
Okay. In general, can you get fuel there? I know if you go halfway around the world, 100 lowland is practically impossible to obtain.
It is, at the two airports that we talked about, the major ports of entry, there is 100 lowland available. In discussions with the government, they had said that, yes, if you are going to another airport, we can have it sent there. We've got reports from those people that have actually done flights and coordinated trips down there, that it is a difficult situation to get fuel. Again, the third-party providers, those that have done those trips and are working that, are going to be the best answer about a specific airport. But again, with the current restrictions, you're not going to be able to go into anything other than an international airport, which are one of the larger ones. Mm-hmm. So those stand the best chance of getting fuel, but it is a planning consideration. Also remember, Key West is only 90 miles away. So if you tank up in Key West and your gross weight and useful load permit, you can probably get it back.
So here's a question that is both specific to what we're discussing and a little more general, but is also very near and dear to my heart. Let's bring third-class medical reform into the discussion very briefly, having nothing to do with what's underneath medical reform, but having to do with the scope of global versus local there.
Yeah, that's a big issue, and that's something we're taking a look at on a number of different fronts. So we'll be working with the Cuban government in order to secure permission. So once we have the final what's going to happen with that, we'll be moving forward. It's too premature right now to be able to comment on that one.
Of course, but you know the answer is wait and see, is what it sounds like. I have to say, Alfonso, you amused me here, and there's a part of me that understands where you're coming from. Alfonso says, all caps, "This is immensely complicated. Cancel my flight plan!" Exclamation point, exclamation point.
And that's why I led off with, don't let this scare you away. If you took a look, if you're being a flight student and they hand you a bucket full of books, an AIM, the pilot operating handbook and everything, and said, all right, here, learn this right now, you would have walked away from flight training. Eventually, you had to cover all that information. It is not that complicated you need to know these things that are there. And again, working with qualified people, you can overcome that. So don't let this dissuade you to go down to the island. It's definitely going to be worth it if you do.
Do you have any idea if fuel is astronomically expensive or double or?
They had quoted us that it was reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
And again, depends on availability. If it's at an airport that doesn't have it, obviously trucking it in, you're talking significantly higher. But in general, they were saying it was around average.
Okay. Craig, I'm going to do something that's not very fair.
Okay.
I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball, and we both know if the answer is we don't know, and we don't know. Do you know anything about an outlook on the potential for tourist travel, whether or not it's even being talked about?
It is being talked about. There is a group called Engage Cuba, which is doing a lot of work on Capitol Hill in order to try and promote both the economic benefits to the United States and Cuba of eliminating the travel restrictions. We have embargoes on North Korea, but I can still go to North Korea. So there's a lot of people that are saying, how come I can't go to Cuba? And that is a larger issue. I think it's not going to happen this year. As you know, this is a crazy political year. There's
really? Is there something going on?
Yeah, one or two things.
Oh, okay.
And so I don't think that we're going to get anything this year. I do think that eventually it will come, but there's, again, a lot of infrastructure improvements which are going to have to take place. I know they're working on that down in Cuba for building more hotels, building additional facilities. So part of them, it may be preventing a flood, shall we say, of people coming over until they're ready. So,
okay, fair enough. Finally, I'm going to kind of take the answer to this question. We've got a number of people this evening asking us, who are these third-party providers? Whether or not we have a list, whether or not we can give some examples. Well, it turns out Craig and I just had a meeting earlier today with some of the other stakeholders here in my department in the Pilot Information Center. We're working on figuring out how we can compile a list, what the criteria would be, and getting a list out on our website in our Caribbean travel area, specifically near the bottom, in order to provide some third-party provider handler information to our members who have that question. So stay tuned in that regard. Anything you want to add there?
Yeah, a lot of work is underway to, as you know, we've redesigned the website, and we're working on bringing a number of those pages up to speed. So we should have something posted very shortly.
Exactly. Anything else?
I appreciate the opportunity, and sorry about the miscommunication, and if you were hearing us the whole time, our apologies as well. So.
we didn't tell any good jokes, so
No.
We're not in trouble. All right, well, Craig, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time and your insights. This is it's been very revealing, and as you said, it's not that we're suggesting that people should or shouldn't go to Cuba. We just want people to understand the ins and outs and share what we've come to find, and to share our involvement. So
Yes,
as well.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity.
So, on that note, thank you so much for joining us this evening. If you do have any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact myself and our staff here at our Pilot Information Center. You can do so Monday through Friday, 8:30 a.m. through 6 p.m. Eastern Time via the phone number on your screen, 800-USA-AOPA. That's 800-872-2672. And then press option 2 on your phone to talk to our aviation technical specialists. You can also email your questions to us. The easiest way is to email Pilot Assist, that's one word, Pilot Assist at AOPA.org. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you again here sometime soon in the near future on our next interesting topic. And maybe we'll let Craig off the hook that time, and we'll have someone else talk themselves until they need a drink of water, because I need a drink of water.
Thank you, Ferdi. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Have a great evening, everyone.